Tim,
Thank you.
if it didn't wake you up, something on, you're on fire.
Well, I gotta cut off this ringer because it's gonna happen again.
Okay. We got you from behind the podium, so you're a little bit more comfortable. So we want to get the dialogue started and start with a few questions, and then it's for you. After hearing that, I think the majority of the people out here could quote many of the statistics back or experience themselves many of the things that you did talk about.
Right.
So when we get into a situation that in our everyday, and we go through this exercise of diversity in our jobs, in our organizations, we can talk about it amongst ourselves. We can have a great speaker like you come up here and talk about it as well. But in the everyday, the idea of discussing diversity in the workplace with any fervor such as this, if any one of these folks went into the workplace and discussed diversity the way you talk diversity, they would definitely have to look for a new job. So,
it's nice to have this job. I don't have
it. It is nice to have this job. So let's be honest. What do we do? I mean, if it comes down to the simple fact that diversity training almost is a sham.
Yeah, it is.
What do we do if we've been enlightened and now want to enlighten our coworkers or challenge our coworkers? What do we do without getting fined?
Right. Well, there's always time and place issues, and I mean, I can get up and speak like that in this room because this is sort of, to me, this is church, and I'm Jewish, so that says a lot. We don't really speak like that in the synagogue. Yeah, I can be a cancer, but I can't carry it too, but I can do that. But if I'm doing a one-on-one conversation, or if I'm doing a workshop where it's more personal and more intimate, you're talking to 5, 10, 15, 20 people, I don't do that. Those who have been in a workshop with me, I don't get up and scream at you, preach at you, all that. It's much more give and take, and it's much more dialogic. And it's much more about asking questions. I mean, I think the way that we start to approach these things in our workplace, in our schools, in our neighborhood associations, churches, synagogues, mosques, nonprofit organizations, is the way that I try to approach it in my book. And I'm not just saying that so y'all go out and buy it, though. I would take the 15 hard-earned dollars and liberate you from some cash in a minute. But in the book, what I try to do, because that's a little bit more intimate thing when you're reading somebody's words or you're going to talk about it, is I try to start with me and to tell my own story about privilege, right? Because it's one thing to get up and throw a bunch of data around.
Right.
And it's important that we know the data. It's very important that we have that because there are some people who will never be convinced until they see the numbers. So I get that. But I wanted to start by telling stories because it seemed to me that the one thing that usually brings people in is if we talk about my own privilege as a white person. Even though I grew up in a family with very little money, so on an economic level I didn't have class privilege, but I still received white privilege, and I go into great detail about what that looked like. People I have found don't get as defensive about the conversation at that point because it's not as threatening. I'm just telling you my story, and you tell me yours, and we'll have a conversation. And if yours is different than mine, then we can tease that out a little bit. If it's similar, we can tease that out. It allows people to come into the conversation much more so than if I just start talking about systemic injustice at some grand scale, which we have a clear psychological incentive to ignore. We don't want to think about that, particularly in our own country that we have this perception of as this equitable and fantastic place that's conquered all these demons. So I always say start with yourself and start by asking questions as opposed to just making declarative statements. If I'm going to have a conversation with someone about race, I want to ask them, where did you learn the things that you think you know about race? And I want to hear what that was. Where did we get our ideas about race? I have this conversation with 5th graders in middle school, and not just full-grown adults who are prepared to have it, but 5th grade kids. I'll go in and say, where do we get our ideas about race and racism? Stereotypes and prejudice and all that. And these are 10-year-olds, maybe 11-year-olds, and they will raise their hand just on the spot and come up with fantastic answers. And they're all usually about the media. They talk about the way the media represents race and all the things that they, at the age of 10, are already having to deal with. So I think we can have the conversation, have it honestly, and non-threateningly, even as it's a critical conversation. It's not easy. We're not going to solve that, but we can do it by starting with ourselves, by asking questions that elicit answers from the person we're discussing it with, and make them sort of come to where we want them to be without having to hit them over the head. It's about asking. Any of you have seen the movie The Color of Fear? I know many of you have. It's a fantastic point in the film where these men of color have gotten together, and two white men have gotten together to talk about race. And one of the black men is a dear friend of mine, Victor Lewis. If you've seen the film, you know this lovely, beautiful thing that he does. He just explodes on this white guy, David Christian. Because David, for 3 hours, only 10 minutes of film, but 3 hours of actual real-time footage, had just been pumping all of this same kind of, America's the greatest place on earth, that anybody can make it if they try, and we all stand on our own 2 feet. And Victor, I think you're blocking your own progress. And that just set him off, and then he was done. And Vic goes off, and it's just amazing 40 seconds or so of footage. And then right after Vic does that, that sort of softens David up a bit, because now he's been hit with this visceral, raw truth. And then Layman Waugh, the filmmaker, comes behind that and does something that's really quite brilliant. It's this question-asking thing that I'm talking about, where he says, David, and I'm paraphrasing here, this is pretty close, David, what would it mean to you if the things that you're hearing from Victor and these other men of color were really happening to them? That they're not making it up? What would it mean to you in your world if this was true? Now, that's not really a question, right? That's really a statement. But he asked it as a question, rephrased it, and David, in that moment, you see, if you've seen the film, his eyes start to water, his whole body language changes, and he ends up saying, that would be horrible. I would hate to think that man was capable of that kind of inhumanity to his fellow man. But you know in that moment that he does believe it. Why? Because he's been brought to that truth by the 1-2 punch of visceral truth stated clearly and without apology, and a question that was very compassionate and allowed him to come to where we wanted to be. I think that's where we need to go in terms of so-called diversity training. First of all, diversity is really the point. Equity is the point. We can have diversity without equity. Diversity fits in very nicely with Minnesota Nice, which is something we need to frankly bury. Minnesota Nice, for those who don't understand this, is something which, within the context of discussing race, makes it really hard, I think, in the state. And other states have similar equivalents of it. Nashville, where I live, has an equivalent of it. But Minnesota Nice keeps the lid on, and the lid needs to be blown off if we're going to really deal with the problem.
Yeah, that's my next question. How do you deal in a state where Minnesota Nice permeates everything from interpersonal relationships to social political relationships? And it seems to be getting worse as our society speeds up. And I say that because we have people who don't want to deal with the everyday. So how are you going to have people deal with something that is so intrinsically visceral? How do you get people to get past that fear of themselves to conquer the fear of the unknown?
Look, I think fear is an okay emotion from which to operate. It really all is about what are you afraid of. Fear's fine, but if you're manipulating me to be afraid of my neighbor and making me think that they're members of an Al-Qaeda sleeper cell, or child molesters or drug dealers or whatever, you're manipulating me and you're playing upon fears which are probably not going to lead in a very constructive direction. I think we ought to be very afraid in this country. The way I think we get people who are afraid of confronting the truth to confront it is by making it clear to them that there's something that we should be more afraid of than the truth. And that is not talking about the truth. See, I'm very afraid that if we don't deal with this society's not going to survive. And in fact, I think life on the planet may not go on for too terribly long, because privilege and inequality and resource extraction, which we feel entitled apparently to do for the sake of maintaining our way of life, is stretching the ecological limits of our planet. And all of that is very much interrelated. So if we don't get off this train pretty quick, there's going to be a disaster that is going to take with it not only people of color, but an awful lot of white folks. And I think that if we're clear about that and we say, listen, this is not a sustainable way of living. This is a way of living which pays the bills for a while and gives you relative advantage, and that may taste pretty good, but here's the train wreck that's coming. It's like getting on that boat crossing the River Styx thinking it's a real nice ride, forgetting what is on the other side of the River Styx, right, in mythological terms. So understanding that and understanding this isn't something which can go on forever means that we can begin to talk about fear, we can begin to talk about pain, we can begin to talk about how difficult it is to have the conversation, but try to steer it towards what's going to happen if we don't confront it, because that is far more destructive. The people of South Africa learned that, right? I mean, they tried to cut it off. White folks in South Africa tried to cut it off. And